My brother filed Dad's life insurance claim in his name alone, saying it was easier this way, while I was still crying at the funeral. When I pointed out it wasn't true, he shrugged and said, "You wouldn't know what to do with the money anyway." I just stared at him. That was 19 months ago. This morning, he was standing outside my apartment in tears. My greedy brother tried to claim our father's life insurance alone because it was Dad's unspoken wish, so I fought him in court and left him broke. When our dad passed away last year, it was sudden and devastating. We were all grieving, and the last thing on my mind was money. Our father had worked his whole life and made sure to have a life insurance policy in place for his kids, me and my older brother, Kyle. From as far back as I can remember, Kyle has always acted like the golden child. Dad never outright played favorites, but Kyle always acted like he was entitled to more because he was the firstborn son. Growing up, he'd say things like, "When Dad's gone, I'll be the one taking care of everything, so it makes sense I'll get more." At the time, I thought it was just childish talk. Now I know it was foreshadowing. After Dad's funeral, I assumed we would work together to settle his affairs. A few days later, I called the insurance company to let them know he'd passed. That's when they told me, "Oh, your brother already contacted us. He's filed the claim." I was shocked. The policy named both of us as equal beneficiaries. When I confronted Kyle, he acted like I was crazy. "Oh, I thought you didn't care about the money," he said. "You were so busy crying at the funeral. I figured you didn't want to deal with paperwork. I'm just handling things for you." That might sound nice, except when I asked for the claim details, he said, "Well, actually, I told them I'm the sole beneficiary. It's just easier this way." Easier for who? When I pointed out that it wasn't true, he shrugged and said, "Dad always wanted me to take care of the finances. You wouldn't know what to do with the money anyway." That one sentence made my blood boil. This is the same brother who once spent an entire year's tax refund on a limited edition gaming console, and then begged me to loan him rent money. I called the insurance company again and told them I never gave permission for Kyle to claim the policy alone. They froze the payout and opened an investigation. That's when Kyle started getting nasty. He told relatives I was greedy and trying to take money from him, even though we were both supposed to get half. He said I didn't respect Dad's wishes, and that a good daughter wouldn't fight over money right after a funeral. This was especially infuriating because he was the one trying to take the entire amount before Dad was even buried a week. At one point, he came to my apartment and tried to guilt trip me. "You know, Dad trusted me more because you're too emotional," he said. "I'm just protecting the family legacy. Once I invest it, maybe I'll give you something later." The way he said maybe made it crystal clear. If I didn't fight, I'd get nothing. Things escalated when I received a letter from his lawyer stating that the intent of the policy was for Kyle to be the primary heir, and that I should honor my father's unspoken wishes by signing away my rights. That was it for me. I hired my own lawyer the next day. The evidence was straightforward. The policy clearly named both of us as equal beneficiaries. The only unspoken wishes were in Kyle's imagination. Kyle's response? He called me crying, saying I was tearing the family apart and dragging our father's name through the mud by involving lawyers. He even tried the gaslighting route. "You never actually wanted the money until I brought it up. You're just doing this to hurt me." "No, Kyle. I'm doing this because you lied and tried to steal from me." When we went to court, my lawyer laid everything out: the original policy documents, the insurance company's notes on Kyle's call, even recordings of the conversations where he admitted he filed as sole beneficiary to make it easier. Kyle tried to argue that Dad verbally told him the money should go to him alone. The judge didn't buy it for a second. He asked Kyle why, if that was true, Dad still named us both on the policy. Kyle's answer? He must have forgotten to change it. The judge's face said it all. I won. The court ordered that the insurance payout be split equally as per the policy. But here's the part that still makes me smile. Because of his false claim and the investigation costs, Kyle's legal fees were astronomical. By the end of it, my half of the money stayed intact, and Kyle's half was almost entirely eaten up by his own lawyer bills. And no, I didn't feel sorry for him. Afterward, he sent me one last text. The notification popped up on my phone screen with Kyle's name, and I almost deleted it without reading. My finger hovered over the message for a solid 20 minutes before I finally opened it. "You destroyed our family for money. Dad would be ashamed." My hands started shaking as I read those 4 sentences over and over again. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and watched it like it might explode. Rachel came downstairs for breakfast and found me standing there with tears running down my face. She asked what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words to explain. I blocked Kyle's number right there while she watched me fumble with my phone settings. 3 days later, my phone rang with an unknown number while I was sorting through Dad's old paperwork. The woman on the other end identified herself as being from the insurance company's fraud department. She explained that Kyle had filed an appeal claiming I had somehow forced him into admitting the false claim. Matthew Thompson, the investigator who had handled the original case, needed to interview me again about the phone recordings. I agreed to meet him that afternoon at the Starbucks downtown near my office. Matthew was already waiting when I arrived with a folder full of documents spread across the small table. He showed me Kyle's sworn statement claiming he'd been suffering from mental distress and grief-induced confusion. The paperwork stated I had manipulated him while he was mourning our father's death. Matthew pointed to specific lines where Kyle claimed I had taken advantage of his vulnerable state. I couldn't believe what I was reading as my eyes scanned page after page of lies. Matthew asked me to walk through every conversation I'd had with Kyle since Dad's funeral. That evening my phone rang again, and this time it was Margaret screaming at me from Kyle's phone. She yelled that I had ruined their lives and their mortgage was now in jeopardy. She threatened to tell Rachel about my supposed greed unless I dropped the enforcement of the court order. I hung up on her mid-sentence and immediately called David to tell him about the threats. David had me come to his office the next morning to review Kyle's appeal documents in detail. He spread the papers across his desk and pointed out multiple places where Kyle contradicted his original testimony. The new claims didn't match what Kyle had said under oath during the first court hearing. David warned me this could drag on for months and asked if I was prepared for round 2. I told him I wasn't backing down no matter how long it took. A week later, I was cleaning out the garage when I found Dad's old photo albums tucked behind some boxes. Rachel helped me carry them inside, and we sat on the living room floor looking through them. There were pictures of Kyle and me as kids playing in the backyard and celebrating birthdays together. Rachel kept asking innocent questions about why Uncle Kyle never visited anymore and why he wasn't in any recent photos. I struggled to find age-appropriate answers that wouldn't poison her against her uncle forever. Linda called me that night sounding upset and confused about something Kyle had done. She said Kyle had contacted her asking her to testify that Dad always intended for him to handle all family finances. She refused his request, but warned me he was calling other relatives with the same story. The next afternoon, I was running late to pick up Rachel from school when my phone buzzed with a panicked text. Rachel wrote that Uncle Kyle was at school trying to talk to her outside the main entrance. I drove there as fast as I could while texting the principal about the situation. By the time I arrived, school security had already asked Kyle to leave the premises. The principal met me in her office and explained that Kyle had been asking students where Rachel was. She said they would be filing a report about the incident with the district security office. David immediately filed for a restraining order based on Kyle showing up at Rachel's school. We went to the county courthouse where Judge Brennan reviewed the request and scheduled an emergency hearing for the following week. She noted the involvement of a minor made this a priority case requiring immediate attention. That night at dinner, Rachel broke down crying and asked what she had done wrong to make her uncle act so scary. She kept saying it must be her fault somehow, and maybe she could fix it. I held her while she sobbed and tried to explain that sometimes adults have problems that have nothing to do with kids. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was making breakfast, and Matthew's name showed up on the screen. He told me Kyle had hired James Logan, this lawyer who was known for being really aggressive in court cases. Logan had already sent over 23 different document requests, asking for everything from my bank statements to my work records from the past 5 years. I dropped the spatula I was holding and scrambled to write down everything Matthew was saying while the eggs burned on the stove. The next afternoon, I went to see my therapist, Dr. Charlotte Coleman, for our regular appointment that we'd been doing every 2 weeks since the whole mess started. She sat across from me in her small office with the fake plants and asked how I was handling the guilt about the family breaking apart. I told her about Rachel crying and how Kyle kept pushing harder instead of backing off. She reminded me that standing up for myself wasn't wrong and that Kyle had made his own choices. 2 days after that, David called me at work and said Logan had sent a formal letter threatening to sue me for defamation. The letter claimed I'd been spreading lies about the insurance fraud and that it had damaged Kyle's professional reputation at his accounting firm. David said it was just intimidation tactics meant to scare me into dropping everything. A week later, we all had to go to court for the restraining order hearing, and Logan stood up there arguing that I was being vindictive and that the order wasn't necessary. Margaret actually testified that Kyle was just trying to heal the family and that I was overreacting to his attempts at reconciliation. The judge looked at the evidence, including the photos of Kyle at my workplace and the security footage from Rachel's school, and granted a temporary restraining order anyway. That evening, Linda showed up at my door with a casserole dish full of homemade lasagna, and we sat at my kitchen table while she showed me her phone. Kyle had been calling her every single day, sometimes 3 or 4 times, and the texts were getting worse. He accused her of choosing sides and said if she kept supporting me, he'd make sure she never saw any future grandchildren he might have. She scrolled through message after message where he called her a traitor to the family and said Dad would be ashamed of her. The next morning, David called with more bad news because he'd discovered Kyle had been contacting people I used to work with on LinkedIn. 2 of my former coworkers had forwarded me the messages where Kyle asked about my mental state and whether I had spending problems or substance abuse issues. One message even asked if they'd ever seen me act unstable or violent at work. That night, I couldn't sleep and kept getting up to check all the door locks even though I'd already checked them 3 times. Every car that drove slowly past our house made my heart race, and I jumped so bad when the doorbell rang for a pizza delivery that Rachel asked if I was okay. She noticed I'd started keeping all the curtains closed and that I always looked out the peephole before opening the door, even when we were expecting someone. 2 weeks went by before Logan filed his countersuit claiming I'd caused Kyle intentional infliction of emotional distress and demanding $200,000 in damages. David explained that it was completely baseless, but the whole point was to make me spend money on legal fees defending myself. While we were dealing with that, Matthew called again with something even worse because he'd been digging into Kyle's finances as part of the insurance investigation. He'd found that Kyle had opened 3 different credit cards using Dad's social security number after Dad died, but before we'd even settled the estate. The charges included a 70-inch TV and a vacation to Cancun, and Matthew said this was straight-up identity theft, which meant criminal charges could be filed. The same day, I got a certified letter from the insurance company saying they'd officially denied Kyle's appeal of the original court ruling. They cited the evidence of fraudulent intent and said they were starting their own proceedings to recover the legal costs they'd had to pay because of Kyle's false claim. A week later, Rachel's teacher called me during my lunch break at work. She said Rachel wasn't paying attention in class and had written an essay about families breaking apart. I could hear the worry in her voice as she told me Rachel kept staring out the window during lessons. She suggested I might want to get Rachel some help to process everything that was happening with the family. I made an appointment with a therapist that same afternoon and told Rachel about it when she got home. She just nodded and went to her room without saying anything. That night, Margaret posted on Facebook calling me a money-hungry witch who destroyed a grieving family. She tagged all our mutual friends and even some of Dad's old co-workers in the post. My phone started buzzing with screenshots from friends asking what was going on. One friend sent me a screenshot where Margaret claimed I'd stolen from a grieving widower and his children. Another screenshot showed her saying I was keeping Kyle from his rightful inheritance. David called me the next morning after I forwarded him the posts. He filed a cease and desist letter that afternoon and started documenting everything for possible harassment charges. He told me to stay off social media completely while the legal stuff was still going on. 3 days later, I sat in the waiting room while Rachel had her first therapy session. I scrolled through old texts from Kyle from before Dad died, back when we actually got along. The therapist came out after an hour and said Rachel was doing okay but needed consistency right now. She gave me some tips for helping Rachel at home and scheduled another appointment for next week. 2 weeks after that, Linda forwarded me an email that made my stomach drop. Kyle was claiming he had proof that Dad was coerced into adding me to the life insurance policy. He was asking family members to sign papers saying they believed Dad only wanted Kyle to get the money. The email said Dad had told Kyle privately that he felt pressured to include me on the policy. David immediately filed paperwork to make Kyle show us this supposed proof. We gave him 14 days to produce whatever evidence he claimed to have. David warned me to save every text, email, and voicemail from now on just in case. That same week, our old friend Jessica texted me something crazy. Kyle had been telling all the neighbors that I was mentally unstable and dangerous. He'd warned Jessica to stay away from me for her own safety. She said Kyle seemed really convinced that I was some kind of threat to everyone around me. A week later, Kyle's lawyer Logan finally sent over the evidence Kyle had been talking about. It was a letter supposedly from Dad saying he regretted adding me to the insurance policy. David took one look at it and immediately asked for forensic analysis. The handwriting looked nothing like Dad's and the paper looked brand new. The forensic document examiner confirmed what we already knew within 2 days. The letter was completely fake, made with a computer font designed to look like handwriting. The metadata showed it was created just 2 weeks ago on Kyle's work computer. David called me right away and said this changed everything from a civil case to a criminal one. We drove to the district attorney's office the next morning to file a report. The DA's office opened a criminal investigation into Kyle for forgery and attempted fraud that same day. Detective Janet Mills got assigned to the case and asked us to bring all our documentation from the civil case. 3 days later, I was walking to my car after work when I noticed the same silver sedan parked across from my office building for the third day straight. The windows were tinted, but I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat watching the exit doors. I started walking toward it to get a better look at the license plate, and the engine suddenly roared to life. The car peeled out of the parking spot so fast the tires squealed on the pavement. My hands were shaking as I wrote down what I could remember of the plate number in my phone. That night, I started a notebook documenting every time I saw that car or any other vehicle that seemed to be following me. The next afternoon, Rachel came home from school with tears streaming down her face and threw her backpack on the kitchen floor. Someone had printed out a screenshot of Margaret's Facebook post calling me a gold digger and taped it inside Rachel's locker during lunch. The principal called me 20 minutes later saying they were reviewing security footage to see who had access to the student lockers during that time period. Rachel wouldn't eat dinner and spent the whole evening in her room with the door locked. 2 days after that, Janet called me in for another interview at the police station downtown. She spread out a folder full of documents on the metal table between us and pointed to 2 employment records from Kyle's previous jobs. Both companies had reported financial discrepancies during his time there, but neither had pressed charges because the amounts were under $10,000 each time. She said they were building a pattern of behavior case that went back years before Dad's death. That weekend, Linda came over with a bottle of wine, and halfway through her second glass, she started crying. She told me Kyle had borrowed $30,000 from her last year for some business opportunity that was supposed to triple her investment in 6 months. She never saw a penny back and never told anyone because she didn't want to embarrass him at family gatherings. Now she was seeing how he'd been playing everyone for years. A week later, David called me at work with news that made him sound almost giddy. Logan had filed paperwork withdrawing as Kyle's attorney without any explanation given to the court. David said lawyers only do that when they find out their client has been lying to them about evidence because ethics rules won't let them present false information to a judge. Kyle showed up at the next court hearing representing himself with a stack of handwritten papers. He filed a motion claiming severe emotional distress was preventing him from defending himself properly and asked for all proceedings to be dismissed. The judge looked at him over her glasses and said he was the one who initiated the recent filings, so he couldn't claim he was too distressed to continue. She denied his motion in less than 5 minutes. That night, I couldn't stop checking the locks on my doors and windows over and over. My therapist Charlotte had me sit down and do breathing exercises while we talked about how this was a normal trauma response to everything happening. We made a safety plan that included actual security measures but didn't involve me getting up 12 times a night to check if the deadbolt was still locked. The breakthrough came when Matthew called David with information that changed everything. He'd been going through Dad's email account as part of the insurance investigation and discovered someone had been accessing it after Dad died. The IT logs showed Kyle's IP address logging in multiple times in the weeks after the funeral, and emails between Dad and the insurance company had been deleted from the trash folder. Matthew had recovered them through the email server backups, and they clearly showed Dad confirming both children as equal beneficiaries just 2 months before his death. 2 weeks after that discovery, Janet arrested Kyle at his house for identity theft, fraud, and tampering with evidence. Margaret posted his bail within 3 hours, but now Kyle was facing potential prison time that went way beyond our civil case about the insurance money. That evening, Rachel sat at the kitchen table pushing her food around her plate and finally asked if Uncle Kyle was going to jail because of us. I tried to explain that people face consequences for their choices, and we didn't make him do any of those things, but the guilt in her eyes matched exactly what I was feeling in my chest. The next morning, David called with a thick stack of papers he wanted me to see at his office. I dropped Rachel at school and drove straight there, still thinking about her question from dinner. He spread Kyle's financial records across his conference table like a map of disaster. His IT consulting business had lost 4 major clients in the past 3 months. The bank statements showed he was behind on his mortgage by 3 months. David pointed to highlighted sections showing bounced checks and maxed credit cards. This wasn't just about greed anymore. Kyle was drowning financially before Dad even got sick. 3 days later, Linda called and invited us to dinner at her house. She specifically mentioned she wasn't inviting Kyle's family, which made my stomach tighten. Rachel and I arrived to find Linda had invited 2 other aunts and my cousin Charlotte. Over pot roast, Linda mentioned how the whole family was talking about Kyle's arrest. Charlotte said her mom had called Kyle to get his side, but he just screamed about me destroying the family. Linda shook her head and said everyone was starting to see through his lies now. The criminal charges made it impossible to ignore what he'd really done. A week later, I was loading groceries into my car when Margaret appeared behind me in the parking lot. She grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and begged me to drop the charges. Her face was red and tears streamed down as she said Kyle would lose his professional licenses. She kept saying their kids would suffer and this was all my fault. I tried to pull away, but she wouldn't let go. A security guard saw the struggle and ran over. Margaret screamed at me as he pulled her away. I went straight to the police station and filed another report. The officer took photos of the red marks on my arm. 2 days later, David forwarded me a letter from the state licensing board for IT professionals. They'd opened an ethics investigation into Kyle based on the criminal charges. His ability to work on any financial systems was under review. If they revoked his certifications, he'd basically be unemployable in his field. I should have felt satisfied, but I just felt empty. The inheritance money sat untouched in a separate savings account. Every time I thought about using it for something nice, I remembered the family dinners we'd never have again. I couldn't even look at furniture without thinking about Kyle trying to steal it all. Rachel needed new soccer cleats, but I used my regular checking account instead. That money felt poisoned by everything that had happened. The following Monday, Rachel came to me with an envelope that had been slipped under our door. Inside was a letter from Kyle addressed to her saying he loved her and missed her. He wrote that this was all a big misunderstanding, and Uncle Kyle would fix everything soon. Rachel's hands shook as she gave it to me. She looked scared and confused about why he would write when the judge said he couldn't contact us. I called David immediately and he contacted the prosecutor. Kyle had violated the restraining order by using his mother to deliver the letter. 2 weeks later, I sat in the courthouse for Kyle's arraignment on the criminal charges. He stood in his wrinkled suit and pleaded not guilty to every single charge. The prosecutor stood up and dropped a bomb that made everyone gasp. They'd found evidence of Kyle attempting similar schemes with 2 elderly relatives over the past 5 years. One was our great aunt who died thinking Kyle was managing her finances properly. The other was Dad's cousin who Kyle had convinced to sign over power of attorney right before a surgery. Both times, Kyle had tried to redirect inheritance money to himself. The judge set a trial date for 6 months out. That afternoon, David filed for summary judgment in our civil case based on all the criminal evidence. If the judge granted it, Kyle's countersuit would be thrown out immediately. The insurance money would be distributed according to the original policy without more delays. We'd know within 30 days if the judge would rule in our favor. Walking out of the courthouse, I literally ran into Tom, who'd been Kyle's best friend since high school. He looked uncomfortable and tried to walk past, but then stopped. He admitted Kyle had called him 2 months ago, asking him to lie in court. Kyle wanted Tom to say he'd overheard Dad telling Kyle the money should all go to him. Tom refused and hadn't heard from Kyle since then. He said Kyle got angry and called him a traitor to their friendship. Tom looked sad as he walked away. A week later, I was making dinner when Janet called with news that made me drop the spatula. During the investigation, they'd discovered something nobody knew about. Kyle had taken out a $50,000 loan using Dad's house as collateral. The loan was dated 2 days before Dad died while he was unconscious in the ICU. The bank documents showed Kyle forged Dad's signature while he was dying, and now the house we both inherited was collateral for a loan that was already 3 months behind. I called David immediately, and he said this changed everything, because fraud during someone's final days could mean criminal charges. The next morning, Linda called to tell me Margaret had filed for divorce and moved back with her parents after finding out about the forged loan and all the other lies. Kyle must have gotten the divorce papers because 2 days later, every relative got an email from him saying I destroyed his life over money, and he was going to end it all. Uncle Jim called the police for a welfare check, and they found Kyle with a bottle of pills, but he hadn't taken any yet. They put him on a 72-hour psychiatric hold at Columbus Regional, and the next day a doctor called asking me to come in for Kyle's evaluation. The psychiatrist asked about our family history and Kyle's behavior patterns while Kyle sat there glaring at me through the glass observation window. She said he showed signs of something called narcissistic collapse, but wasn't actually planning to hurt himself, just wanted everyone to feel guilty. 3 days later, when Rachel's school had their father-daughter dance, my friend Mike stepped in to take her since Kyle used to go with her before all this started. Rachel mentioned on the drive home that she missed how her uncle used to be fun before the money thing happened. The following week, David called with good news that Judge Brennan had granted partial summary judgment, ordering the insurance company to distribute the funds according to the original policy immediately. Kyle's countersuit was still pending, but David said it was basically dead in the water after all the fraud evidence. I drove out to Green Lawn Cemetery that afternoon to visit Dad's grave and left his favorite beer while telling him about the mess Kyle had created. Standing there, I wondered if Dad ever suspected Kyle could do something like this, or if he'd be as shocked as I was. A week after that, Kyle got released from the psychiatric hold, and the first thing he did was call my office, leaving threatening voicemails about how I'd pay for ruining him. Security called the police, and when they went to arrest him at his apartment, they found notebooks full of notes about my daily schedule and photos of my house. The insurance company's legal department sent Kyle a letter saying they were suing him for $75,000 in legal costs plus punitive damages for the fraudulent claim he'd filed. His financial situation was getting worse by the day, and Linda heard from his landlord that he was facing eviction. David went back to court to argue for dismissal of Kyle's countersuit, based on his pattern of fraud and harassment. Judge Brennan not only dismissed it, but awarded us $40,000 in legal fees that Kyle would have to pay on top of everything else. The first time I noticed the silver sedan was on my way to work about a week after the judge ordered Kyle to pay those legal fees. It stayed 3 cars behind me the whole drive, and when I turned into the parking garage, it kept going, but something felt off. The next morning, there it was again. Same distance, same careful following. When I took a different route on Wednesday, going through side streets instead of the main road, the sedan adjusted and stayed with me. My hands were shaking when I called David from my office and told him what was happening. He said to start documenting everything everything, take photos if I could, vary my schedule, and consider getting security cameras for my house. I bought a dash cam that afternoon and started taking pictures with my phone whenever I saw the car. 2 weeks of this went by before I finally got answers. I was leaving a coffee shop when a man in his 40s walked up and handed me his business card. He was a private investigator, and Kyle had hired him to follow me and find something, anything, that could help his case. The guy seemed almost embarrassed as he explained that Kyle still owed him money, and there was nothing to find anyway since I just went to work, the grocery store, and home. He'd already told Kyle there was no dirt to dig up, but Kyle kept insisting there had to be something. The PI said he was done with the job and thought I should know what had been happening. I met Linda for coffee that weekend, and she completely broke down when I told her about the PI. She kept saying she should have seen this coming, that Kyle had always been like this even as a kid. She told me about times when they were young and Kyle would manipulate situations to get what he wanted, how he'd lie to their parents and somehow make it seem like other people were the problem. The family always made excuses for him, said boys will be boys, or he's just ambitious, or he'll grow out of it. Linda said she felt responsible for not warning me years ago, but she'd hoped marriage and becoming a father would change him. I was still processing all this when Janet called me with an update. They were adding stalking charges to Kyle's case based on the PI surveillance and those creepy notes they'd found in his apartment during the search. The criminal case was getting stronger, and she felt confident about moving forward. That same week, I got the call that made my blood run cold. Rachel's school counselor said she needed to speak with me urgently about something that happened online. Rachel had received an Instagram message from a fake account with photos of our house, and a message saying she'd regret lying in court about her uncle. The account had been created that morning, and the photos were recent, showing our front door and Rachel's bedroom window from the street. I drove straight to the school and held Rachel while she cried in the counselor's office. The police got involved immediately, and their cybercrimes unit started tracing the account. 3 days later, they had their answer. The Instagram account was traced directly to Kyle's laptop through IP addresses and digital fingerprints. He'd violated his bail conditions by contacting us indirectly and making threats. The judge revoked his bail immediately, and Kyle was arrested again, this time with no option for release before trial. That's when Margaret reached out through David. She wanted to make a deal. She'd testify against Kyle and provide evidence in exchange for immunity from any harassment charges. David met with her and came back with a bombshell. Margaret had emails from Kyle dating back to before Dad died where he talked about the life insurance and how he deserved it all. He'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. She also had text messages where he discussed hiring the PI and his plans to make Becca's life hell until she gives up. Margaret said she was done protecting him and just wanted out. I used some of the inheritance money to take Rachel to Chicago for a weekend. We needed to get away from everything. For 2 whole days, we didn't talk about Kyle or court or any of the drama. We went to museums, ate deep dish pizza, walked along the lake, and just tried to feel normal again. Rachel smiled for the first time in weeks when we went to the aquarium. It felt like we could both breathe again. The next week, I had my regular appointment with Charlotte, my therapist. She noted that I was making real progress with my anxiety. I was sleeping better without the sleeping pills. I'd stopped checking the locks obsessively, though I was still careful and aware of my surroundings. She said trauma doesn't disappear overnight, but I was handling things in a healthy way. Then the call came from Janet about the trial. Kyle's criminal trial was set for 3 months out. She warned me it could take a full week, and I'd definitely have to testify about finding those forged documents in Kyle's apartment. She walked me through what to expect, how the defense might try to trip me up, and how to stay calm on the stand. 2 days later, David called me at work with news that made my stomach drop. He'd been doing his usual checking and found Kyle was selling Dad's stuff on Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist. Things like Dad's watch collection, his vintage tools from the garage, even the fishing gear they used to take on their weekend trips together. These weren't just random items. They were all part of the estate that hadn't been settled yet, and Kyle had no right to sell any of it. David sent me screenshots of the listings where Kyle had posted Dad's prized Rolex with the caption, "Need cash fast, first reasonable offer takes it," and I felt sick seeing Dad's things being treated like yard sale junk. We drove straight to the courthouse and filed for an emergency injunction to stop the sales, and the judge signed it within an hour after seeing the evidence. David had the court clerk send copies to every online marketplace we could find, and by that evening most of the listings were taken down. The next morning, Rachel came to me with a folded piece of paper she'd been carrying around for days, a letter she'd written to Kyle but couldn't bring herself to send. She let me read it, and my heart broke seeing her neat handwriting asking why Uncle Kyle had changed so much, and if he still loved her like he used to when he'd take her to the park. Her therapist had suggested writing it as a way to process her feelings, but seeing those words on paper made everything feel more real and painful. Rachel asked if Kyle would ever be the uncle she remembered, and I didn't have an answer that wouldn't break her heart more. 2 weeks later, we had to go to court for Kyle's pretrial hearing, and I thought I was ready for whatever would happen. Kyle looked terrible when they brought him in, his hair grown out and messy, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look like a stranger. The prosecutor was going through the charges when Kyle suddenly stood up and started screaming at me across the courtroom. He yelled that I'd killed Dad with all the stress I'd caused, that I'd stolen everything from him, that I was evil and Dad would hate what I'd become. The bailiffs grabbed him, but he kept screaming, spit flying from his mouth as he called me every name he could think of. Judge Brennan was banging her gavel and ordering him to stop, but Kyle just got louder, trying to lunge toward me even with the bailiffs holding him back. They dragged him out in handcuffs while he was still screaming threats, and the judge said she'd be adding contempt charges to his case. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't write notes for David, and the prosecutor came over to check if I was okay. The next week brought more bad news when David got a call from the bank about Dad's house. Kyle had taken out a fraudulent loan against it months ago using forged documents, and now that he couldn't make payments, they were foreclosing. The house where we'd grown up, where Dad had lived for 30 years, was going to auction because of Kyle's lies. David worked out a deal where I could bid on it at the auction using my inheritance money, basically buying back what should have stayed in the family anyway. The auction was quick and clinical, just a few investors there besides me, and I got the house for less than it was worth because of the condition Kyle had left it in. Walking through it afterward was harder than I expected. Seeing the holes Kyle had punched in walls, the missing furniture he'd sold, the general mess and neglect everywhere. I spent the next few days cleaning it out, trying to save what I could of Dad's things that Kyle hadn't already destroyed or sold. In Dad's closet, I found a box of cards and drawings Kyle and I had made for him when we were kids. There was one from Kyle's 8th birthday where he'd drawn our whole family as stick figures and written, "I love you, Daddy," in crayon, his letters backward and wobbly. Looking at that innocent kid handwriting, I couldn't connect it to the man who'd just tried to attack me in court. I sat on Dad's bedroom floor surrounded by these memories and wondered when exactly Kyle had turned into someone capable of all this. The following week, David got a call from Kyle's public defender about a possible plea deal. Kyle would plead guilty to the fraud and identity theft charges if the prosecutor would agree to probation instead of prison time. The defender argued that Kyle had mental health issues and needed treatment, not incarceration, and that this was his first offense. David told me not to worry, that these kinds of offers were normal, but rarely accepted in cases with this much evidence. Sure enough, the prosecutor rejected it immediately, saying the stalking and witness intimidation made probation impossible. They counter-offered 18 months in prison followed by 3 years of supervised probation, which was actually less than Kyle could have gotten if it went to trial. The public defender said they'd discuss it with Kyle, but David doubted Kyle would accept anything that included actual prison time. Linda called me that week about organizing something for Dad's birthday, which was coming up in a few days. She wanted to have a small memorial at the cemetery, just family who actually cared about Dad, not the drama and fighting. We met there on a cold Tuesday morning, just me, Rachel, Linda, and Dad's sister Mary, who'd driven up from Cincinnati. We brought flowers and told stories about Dad, trying to remember the good times before everything went bad. Kyle's absence felt huge, like a missing piece of what should have been, and Mary whispered to me that she couldn't believe it had come to this. She remembered Kyle as a baby, how proud Dad had been of his first son, and now he was sitting in jail instead of honoring his father's memory. After the memorial, Margaret called David with something she'd been hiding. She had recordings on her phone of Kyle from months ago, talking about his backup plan if the civil case went badly. In the recordings, Kyle was explaining to someone how he'd move money into cryptocurrency accounts that couldn't be traced or seized by the courts. Margaret had kept quiet about it during their divorce, but now that Kyle was claiming bankruptcy to avoid paying the civil judgment, she wanted to help stop him. David took the recordings straight to the bankruptcy judge, who immediately froze Kyle's filing and ordered a full investigation of his assets. 2 weeks passed with things feeling almost calm. Kyle in jail awaiting trial, the house stuff getting sorted out, Rachel doing better in therapy. I'd installed a new security system at my apartment just to feel safer, with cameras and motion sensors that sent alerts to my phone. That decision saved me at 3 in the morning when my phone started screaming with alerts. The cameras showed Kyle at my front door, working on the lock with some kind of tools, his face clear in the porch light. I called 911 while watching him on the camera, telling them exactly what was happening, that he was violating his restraining order and trying to break in. The police were there in under 5 minutes. Kyle still trying to get through the deadbolt I'd had reinforced just a month earlier. They found a whole kit of burglary tools in his car, along with rope and duct tape that made my skin crawl thinking about what he'd planned. Kyle tried to run when he saw the police lights, but they caught him in my neighbor's yard, tackling him into the wet grass while he screamed that I'd ruined his life. The next morning, Kyle went before the judge for his bail hearing, and the prosecutor laid out everything from the break-in attempt. The judge looked at the burglary tools and rope they'd found in his car and revoked his bail on the spot. Kyle would stay in county jail until trial with new charges of attempted burglary and bail violation added to his case. 3 days later, Rachel asked if she could visit him in jail, and I couldn't say no to my daughter. Linda came with us for support, and we sat in that cold visiting room watching Kyle through the thick glass. He cried when he saw Rachel and kept saying he was sorry, but then turned to me and insisted I'd misunderstood everything about the insurance. Rachel just stared at him and didn't say much after that. The next week brought more bad news for Kyle when the IT licensing board sent their final decision. They permanently revoked all his certifications based on the fraud convictions, which meant his career in financial systems was completely over. A week after that, I finally went back to work full-time after months of taking partial days for court stuff. My coworkers were relieved this whole mess was almost done, and honestly so was I. 2 months later, Kyle's criminal trial started, and I spent 3 hours on the witness stand going through every detail. I showed them the phone recordings I'd made of his threats, and all the documents David had helped me gather. Kyle watched me the whole time with this blank look I'd never seen on his face before. The next day, Margaret took the stand and dropped a bomb on everyone in that courtroom. She told the jury Kyle had started planning to steal the insurance money when Dad first got diagnosed with cancer. She showed emails where Kyle called me easy to manipulate and said I'd never fight back because I was too emotional. The jury looked disgusted as she read each message out loud. Kyle's lawyer tried to stop him, but Kyle insisted on taking the stand to defend himself. He claimed I'd twisted everything and that Dad really did want him to have all the money for his family. But when the prosecutor started asking specific questions, his whole story fell apart piece by piece. He contradicted himself 4 times in 20 minutes, and finally just sat there silent when asked about the forged documents. 3 days later, the IT specialist Janet testified about all the digital evidence she'd found on Kyle's devices. She showed the jury the forged documents he'd created and the tracking software he'd installed to stalk me. The prosecutor's case was so strong and organized that Kyle's lawyer barely even tried to challenge it anymore. During closing arguments, Kyle suddenly stood up and started shouting that the whole system was corrupt. He pointed at me and yelled that I'd bought everyone off with Dad's money. The judge threatened him with contempt charges if he said another word, and Kyle finally sat down shaking with rage. 4 hours later, the jury came back with their verdict, and I watched Kyle's face as they read guilty on every single count. His expression went from disbelief to pure rage, and then just emptiness as each guilty verdict hit him. When they read the final count for attempted burglary, his shoulders just dropped and he stared at nothing. 6 weeks passed before Kyle's sentencing hearing, and I sat in the same courtroom watching him in an orange jumpsuit instead of his usual suit. The judge looked down at him with zero sympathy as she read through all the charges one more time. She talked about how he'd turned family grief into a criminal scheme, and used Dad's death for personal gain. Kyle tried to speak, but his lawyer grabbed his arm and shook his head. The judge said 3 years with possible parole after 18 months, and Kyle's face went white. The bailiff cuffed him and let him out while he kept looking back at me like this was somehow my fault. David met me in the hallway afterward and explained that the insurance company was dropping their civil suit. They'd worked out a deal where Kyle would pay them back through wage garnishment after his release. His total debt was over $200,000 now between legal fees and restitution. Margaret had already filed for divorce and moved out of state according to the paperwork David showed me. Linda called me the next week about Kyle's storage unit that Margaret had abandoned. We spent a Saturday going through boxes of old stuff neither of them wanted anymore. At the bottom of one box we found photos from when we were kids with Dad at the lake. Linda kept one where Dad had his arms around both Kyle and me when we were maybe 10 and 12. She put it in her purse without saying anything, but I saw her wipe her eyes. I finally felt ready to touch Dad's insurance money after everything settled down. Rachel and I went to the bank together and set up her college fund first. The rest went toward paying off the house so we'd never have to worry about losing it. Rachel hugged me in the parking lot and said Dad would be proud of how we handled things. We started seeing a family therapist together every other week to work through everything that happened. Rachel had been carrying guilt about testifying against her uncle and needed to hear it wasn't her fault. The therapist helped her understand that Kyle made his own choices, and she just told the truth. After 3 months of sessions, Rachel started smiling more and stopped having nightmares about the trial. Margaret sent me an email 6 months after Kyle went to prison apologizing for everything. She said she was living with her sister in Portland and starting over with a new job. She thanked me for not pressing charges against her and said she should have seen who Kyle really was. I didn't write back, but I didn't delete it either. Kyle's first letter from prison came 8 months into his sentence, and it was exactly what I expected. 3 pages of how I'd ruined his life and stolen his inheritance and turned everyone against him. He listed every single thing I'd supposedly done wrong since we were kids. Charlotte came over that night and found me crying at the kitchen table with the letter. She asked why I didn't just throw it away, and I couldn't really explain it. Maybe I needed proof that he still didn't get it, or maybe I just needed to see his anger on paper. Charlotte helped me put it in a folder with all the other legal documents from the case. Linda hosted Thanksgiving that year and invited everyone who'd stood by me during the trial. We set the table for 12 people and nobody mentioned Kyle's name once. Rachel put a framed photo of Dad in the center of the table next to the turkey. She'd written him a card thanking him for the insurance that would pay for her college. Linda read it out loud, and we all cried a little, but it felt good too. On the anniversary of Dad's death, Rachel and I drove to the cemetery with fresh flowers. She'd made honor roll that semester and wanted to tell him about it. We sat by his headstone while she talked about her grades and her new friends and how much she missed him. Neither of us mentioned Kyle, even though his absence felt huge. We stayed until the sun started setting and walked back to the car holding hands. 6 months into Kyle's sentence, I finally unblocked his number on my phone but didn't call or text. Rachel and I had found our rhythm with Tuesday dinners at Linda's house and therapy every other Thursday. We were learning that family meant the people who showed up when things got hard. The inheritance money sat in trust accounts earning interest for Rachel's future. It felt clean now after everything we went through to keep it. Sometimes I thought about Kyle in his cell probably still writing lists of my sins, but mostly I thought about Dad and how he'd wanted us both taken care of. Kyle chose greed over family and lost everything while I chose family and found out what it really meant. The money was never really the point anyway.